Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. This is what's been going on in China in the past 24 hours. Since the U.S. operation that grabbed Nicolas Maduro and flew him to New York, China has moved fully into damage control mode. Publicly, it's been the same hardline language we talked about yesterday: sovereignty, international law, condemnations at the UN, the whole script. But what's new in the last 24 hours is the realization setting in, both inside Beijing and among China's partners, that China genuinely did not see this coming. Chinese officials have acknowledged quietly that the timing alone points to a serious intelligence failure. When your senior envoy is still in the presidential palace hours before an extraction, that's not just bad luck. That's a blind spot. And the implications are spreading. Latin American governments that have been balancing between Washington and Beijing are now reassessing what Chinese all-weather support really means in practice. China can invest, lend, and sell equipment, but when the U.S. decides to act militarily in its hemisphere, Beijing's toolkit is basically microphones and meeting rooms. That contrast is now baked into the regional conversation. There's also a technical angle emerging that didn't fully land yesterday. Venezuelan air defenses, many of them Chinese-made and once marketed as capable of detecting stealth aircraft, appear to have provided little to no warning during the U.S. raid. Some of that comes down to poor maintenance and integration, but the optics matter. For China, which has been trying to sell itself as a credible alternative arms supplier to the U.S. and Europe, this is not a great testimonial. Taipei, Tokyo, and others are absolutely watching that part closely. Inside China, the online reaction hasn't cooled. It's evolved. Yesterday it was raw emotion. Today it's turning into argument. Nationalists are still pounding the table about Taiwan, but more pragmatic voices are pushing back, pointing out that grabbing one man in Caracas is not the same as landing hundreds of thousands of troops across the Taiwan Strait. That tension between chest-thumping and cold math is playing out very publicly before the censors step in. Which brings us again to Taiwan. The large-scale Justice Mission 2025 drills wrapped up, but the aftershocks are still rolling. New details are emerging about just how disruptive those exercises were. Nearly 1,000 civilian flights were affected. Shipping traffic was rerouted. Air and sea lanes that Taiwan relies on were treated like training props. This wasn't just military signaling. It was a rehearsal for what pressure feels like on a daily basis. Japanese officials also confirmed additional Chinese bomber and fighter activity through the Okinawa-Miyako corridor, reinforcing something we've talked about before. Beijing is normalizing long-range operations beyond the first island chain. None of this violated airspace, but that's not the point. The point is familiarity. Every transit, every scramble, every radar track builds muscle memory on both sides. At the same time, China kicked off 2026 with across-the-board military training that looked a lot less ceremonial and a lot more operational. Rocket Force units ran drills featuring hypersonic missiles. Air Force units practiced rapid launch scenarios. The Navy focused on coordinated formations. Army units trained with unmanned systems, including loitering munitions and FPV drones. This wasn't a parade warm-up. It was a reminder that the PLA wants to look ready on day 1, not day 30. One wrinkle worth flagging is China's experimentation with containerized weapon systems mounted on civilian-style cargo ships. Over the last day, analysts have been dissecting imagery showing vertical launch missile cells, radars, close-in weapons, and even drone launch capability stacked onto what is essentially a merchant hull. This isn't subtle, and it's probably not meant to be. It's about scalability. In a Taiwan scenario, numbers matter, and China has more commercial hulls than anyone on the planet. Even if this stays experimental, the concept alone complicates regional planning. Now, zooming out diplomatically, Beijing has been busy trying to make sure Venezuela doesn't define the week. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's visit to China wrapped with warm language and a stack of cooperation agreements. This is an update from yesterday in tone rather than substance. The deals are familiar: AI, digital economy, trade, tourism. But what stood out in the last 24 hours was the security subtext. Lee is clearly asking China to play a more constructive role with North Korea, even as Pyongyang test-fired hypersonic missiles and launched ballistic missiles days earlier. China, for its part, avoided any public mention of denuclearization, sticking instead to vague language about peace and stability. That silence is becoming policy. At the same time, Beijing is clearly trying to pull Seoul just far enough away from Tokyo to create daylight. Xi leaned hard on shared historical narratives about World War II and resisting Japanese militarism. It's an old playbook, but the fact that it's being dusted off now tells you how much China values even marginal shifts in alignment. Europe is another front where China is working the margins. Irish Prime Minister Michel Martin's meetings in Beijing are being framed as a bridge to the EU at a moment when China-Brussels relations are strained over tariffs. Over the last day, Chinese officials emphasized cooperation in artificial intelligence and pharmaceuticals, while downplaying without resolving the trade retaliation on dairy and beef. The strategy is pressure the bloc, charm individual states, and hope the math works out. Meanwhile, China doubled down on its relationship with Pakistan. Statements over the last 24 hours stressed upgraded cooperation under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and praised Pakistan's counter-terrorism efforts. What makes this more interesting now is the quiet warming between Islamabad and Washington. Beijing is clearly aware that Pakistan is hedging, and it's responding by reaffirming loyalty and investment. Classic great power relationship maintenance. Technology continues to hum along as the less flashy but arguably more decisive battleground. NVIDIA's announcement that its next-generation AI chips are in full production landed hard in Beijing. Demand for high-end chips inside China remains strong, but export controls are still the gatekeeper. Chinese firms can buy, but only what Washington allows. That asymmetry hasn't changed, and if anything, the performance jump being promised just widens the gap. On the internal front, control is tightening. The draft revision to China's police law moved forward, expanding authorities across public security, state security, courts, and prosecutors. This isn't just bureaucratic housekeeping. It's about ensuring loyalty and discipline at a time when the external environment is getting rougher and internal confidence is shakier. Add to that a new senior official placed under investigation as part of the ongoing anti-corruption campaign, and the message is consistent: fall in line or you're next. Hong Kong also popped back onto the radar in the last day, positioning itself as a global law enforcement connector. Preparations are underway to host Interpol's General Assembly, with an emphasis on cybercrime, financial fraud, and cooperation with Southeast Asia. Beijing wants Hong Kong to project normalcy and international relevance, even as its political space remains tightly controlled. Thanks so much for listening and for being part of the RH community. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribing, leaving a quick 5-star review, or sharing it with someone you know makes a huge difference. It's how this network will grow. We also publish a daily written intel brief on Substack, where you'll find even deeper coverage of Russia and China, along with insights on the Middle East and the DPRK. This is free for Substack subscribers. Starting January 16th, new Substack subscribers will move to a paid model. If you're already subscribed on Substack before then, nothing changes. You'll keep full access to everything, free forever. New subscribers after January 15th will receive the daily written brief, weekly deep dives on economics, sanctions, and more for a monthly fee. So if you're not on Substack yet, don't worry. Just head to restrictedhandling.com and subscribe now for free and get the content free forever.